George Thompson came in for lunch and left in tears after a manager humiliated him in front of strangers. The room froze. Everyone watched. No one expected what happened next. Just as the police sirens grew louder, a man stepped forward and asked one question that made the manager's face turn pale. "Who touched my father?" Ensure you are subscribed to the channel, and please tell me in the comments below what city you are watching from. George Thompson sat alone with his plate in front of him, unaware that this would be the last peaceful meal he would have in that place. He had come just after noon, the same time he always did on Fridays. The walk from his apartment took him 20 minutes, slow but steady. His knees hurt these days, and his hands shook when he carried small things, but he still preferred to walk. It made him feel like he was still in control of his life. For years, this restaurant had been his one small routine. He didn't go for excitement. He went because it was familiar. He liked knowing what the menu looked like before he opened it. He liked that the servers recognized him and asked, "The usual, Mr. Thompson?" without waiting for his answer. He liked sitting in the same spot and eating at his own pace without being rushed. George didn't talk much. Most days, he kept his thoughts to himself and watched people come and go. Families laughed too loudly. Office workers argued over bills. Couples leaned close to each other and whispered. No one paid much attention to the old man eating alone, and that suited him just fine. He always paid in cash. He always left a small tip, and he always said thank you before standing up to leave. This Friday felt no different when he walked in. He nodded at the young server who was wiping down a table. She smiled back and led him to his usual spot. He ordered the same meal he always did and waited with his hands folded in front of him. His jacket hung loosely on his shoulders. His face showed the deep lines of a long life, but his eyes were calm. George had lived long enough to know when places changed. The mood of a room told you everything. That day, something felt off. The server looked nervous. She kept glancing toward the counter. George didn't know why, but he felt it in the air. A man he had never seen before stood near the entrance, watching the room like it belonged to him. He wore a stiff expression and spoke sharply to a worker who tried to pass by him. George assumed he was the new manager. New faces came and went. He had learned not to ask questions. His food arrived, and he began to eat slowly. Halfway through his meal, he noticed the man again. The manager's eyes kept landing on him. Not in a normal way. It felt like being measured, judged. George lowered his fork and pretended not to notice. He had learned long ago that silence kept him safe. Growing up, he had been taught to stay calm, keep his voice down, and never give people a reason to see him as trouble. He had worked 35 years on factory floors and never once raised his voice at a supervisor. That habit stayed with him. When the manager finally walked toward him, George felt his chest tighten. "Are you done yet?" the man asked. George looked up slowly. "Almost, sir." The manager's jaw tightened. "You've been sitting here a long time." George nodded. "I come every Friday. I always pay." The words came out gentle, not defensive. "I've had complaints," the manager said. "You can't just sit here without ordering properly." George pointed to his plate. "I ordered. I'm eating." The manager stared at the food as if it didn't count. His voice dropped, but his anger rose. "You need to finish up and leave." George felt heat crawl up his neck. People nearby had gone quiet. He could feel their eyes without turning his head. "I haven't done anything wrong," George said. His voice shook, despite his effort to keep it steady. "I've been coming here for years." The manager stepped closer. "Not anymore." George placed his fork down carefully. His hands trembled. This wasn't about food. He knew that. He had felt this before, in other places, in other years. The look, the tone, the way a simple lunch turned into a problem. He thought about his son, Elijah. Elijah always told him not to let people talk to him like that. But George didn't want trouble. He just wanted to eat and go home. "I'll pay and leave," George said quietly. "Just let me finish." The manager's face hardened. "Get up." The word hit harder than a shout. George stayed seated, not out of pride, out of confusion. out of disbelief that this was happening to him in a place that had felt safe for so long. Around him, forks stopped moving. A woman near the window pulled out her phone. A man near the counter stood halfway up from his chair. George felt small, smaller than he had in years. This place had been his routine, his break from loneliness, his one space where no one questioned him. And now, without warning, that routine was breaking apart in front of everyone. He looked down at his plate, then back up at the man standing over him. "I just came to eat," George said. The manager raised his hand. And everything George had trusted about that place disappeared in a single moment. Raymond Carl believed the restaurant had been slipping long before he arrived. On his first week as manager, he made it clear he wanted things done his way. He walked the floor with a tight jaw and a sharp voice, correcting servers in front of customers and watching every table like a guard on duty. He said he cared about standards, about keeping the place respectable, but what he really meant became obvious to the staff within days. Raymond treated people differently. When well-dressed customers came in, he greeted them with a smile and a nod. He asked if everything was to their liking. He joked with them at the counter and waved off small mistakes. But when certain customers walked through the door, his mood changed. His voice turned cold. His patience disappeared. The staff noticed it first. A young waitress whispered to another worker one afternoon, "He only gets angry at some people." The other one replied, "Yeah, you know which ones." Raymond never said his thoughts out loud in full. He didn't use slurs. He didn't openly insult anyone. Instead, he used words like suspicious, loitering, and not the right crowd. He watched certain customers more closely than others. He questioned them about their orders. He checked their receipts twice. He stood near their tables as if waiting for a mistake. To Raymond, power meant control. He believed the restaurant was his territory. Anyone who didn't fit his idea of who belonged there became a problem he needed to handle. George Thompson became one of those problems the moment Raymond noticed him. Raymond saw an elderly black man sitting alone, wearing old clothes and eating slowly. In Raymond's mind, that meant trouble. He assumed George would complain, not pay, or sit too long without ordering enough. He didn't see a regular customer. He saw someone who didn't match the image he wanted for the restaurant. From behind the counter, Raymond watched George closely. Every time George lifted his fork, Raymond's eyes followed. When George paused to rest his hands, Raymond took it as wasting space. When George looked down at his plate, Raymond assumed he was unsure or confused. Raymond walked over to the server who had taken George's order. "Has he paid?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "He always pays at the end. He comes every week." Raymond frowned. "That's not how we do things here." "It's how we've always done it," she replied quietly. Raymond didn't answer. He just kept watching George. In his mind, he told himself he was protecting the business. He believed customers like George scared away better ones. He believed that if he didn't act, the restaurant would lose respect. He wrapped his prejudice in business language so it sounded reasonable. When a couple in business clothes walked in, Raymond smiled and opened the door for them. He asked if they wanted a table near the window. When George asked for more water, Raymond ignored him and walked past. The difference was clear. George tried not to draw attention to himself. He ate slowly and kept his eyes down. But Raymond's frustration grew. He felt like George was challenging him just by sitting there. Raymond leaned toward one of the cooks and muttered, "I don't like people hanging around like that. Makes the place look bad." The cook didn't respond. He kept working. Raymond felt alone in his thinking, and that made him angrier. He believed no one understood his job. He believed discipline meant force, and force meant being loud. When Raymond finally walked over to George's table, he didn't come to ask how the meal was. He came ready to remove him. "You've been here too long," Raymond said, his voice stiff and sharp. George looked up, surprised. "I'm almost finished." Raymond didn't like the calm reply. He saw it as resistance. "I've had complaints," Raymond said, though none had been made. "You can't just sit here." George tried to explain. I ordered food. I always come here. Raymond's face tightened. He felt his authority slipping. People nearby were watching now. That made him feel exposed. In Raymond's mind, this was no longer about a customer. It was about proving control. He leaned closer and said, You need to leave. George's voice trembled when he answered, I haven't done anything wrong. Raymond didn't hear the words. He only heard defiance. He only saw someone he believed didn't belong. Around them, the room grew quiet. Phones came out. A man stood up from his chair. A server froze in place. Raymond felt the eyes on him and mistook them for support. He raised his hand, convinced he was enforcing order. In that moment, Raymond Carl showed everyone exactly who he was. The slap landed before George Thompson could finish his sentence. It wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it was loud enough that everyone heard it. The sound cut through the room and left a heavy silence behind it. George's head turned slightly to the side, and for a moment, he didn't move at all. His fork slipped from his fingers and hit the table with a small clatter. Raymond Carl's hand stayed in the air for a second longer than it should have. His face was tight, his jaw locked, as if he had crossed a line but didn't yet realize how far. George lifted his hand to his cheek. The skin burned. His chest felt tight, not from pain, but from shock. He had been spoken to badly before in his life. He had been ignored. He had been insulted. But no one had struck him like this in public in decades. A woman near the window gasped. Someone whispered, Did he just hit him? A chair scraped against the floor as a man stood up halfway from his seat. George tried to speak, but nothing came out. His throat felt dry. He could feel his heart beating in his ears. His eyes moved around the room, taking in faces that looked confused, angry, and scared all at once. Raymond didn't step back. Instead, he straightened up as if he had just done something necessary. I told you to leave, Raymond said. His voice was louder now. You don't get to sit here and ignore me. George finally found his voice. It was weak and unsteady. You didn't have to hit me. The words sounded small, even to him. A young server rushed forward. Sir, please, she said to Raymond. You can't do that. Raymond turned on her. Stay out of this. Go back to work. She froze where she stood. George's cheek throbbed. His hands shook as he tried to push himself up from the seat, but his knees felt weak. He sat back down, embarrassed by his own body. He hated that people were watching him struggle. A phone appeared in the air. Then another. Then another. A man near the counter started recording openly. This isn't right, he said. You can't just slap an old man. Raymond noticed the phones and sneered. Record whatever you want. He was causing trouble. I was eating, George said quietly. That's all I was doing. Raymond pointed at him. You were refusing to leave when I told you to. That's trespassing. George shook his head. I didn't know I wasn't allowed to finish my food. His voice cracked at the end of the sentence. He hated that it did. Someone from the back of the room said, Man, you went too far. Another person said, Call the police. Raymond laughed once, sharp and short. For what? I'm the manager. That word hung in the air like a shield he thought would protect him. George felt smaller with every second. His ears rang. His cheek felt hot. But worse than the physical pain was the feeling that he had been turned into a spectacle. He had come in quietly. He had ordered politely. Now he was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. A woman near him leaned over. Sir, are you okay? She asked. George nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. I just want to go home. He reached for his wallet with trembling hands. Bills slipped out and fell onto the table. He tried to gather them, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. Raymond stepped closer again. Don't touch anything else. You've already caused enough mess. That was when something inside George broke. Not anger, not shouting, just a deep, heavy sadness. I worked all my life, George said. His voice was low, but people leaned in to hear him. I raised my son. I never asked anyone for trouble. I come here because it's quiet. I don't bother anyone. Raymond rolled his eyes. I don't care about your story. George looked up at him. Then why did you hit me? There was no good answer to that. The room stayed silent. Phones kept recording. A man in a blue shirt moved closer, putting himself between Raymond. You need to step back, the man said. You assaulted him. Raymond puffed up his chest. Mind your business. It is my business now, the man replied. Everyone saw it. George felt tears forming, and that made him angry at himself. He wiped his face quickly, hoping no one noticed. But someone did. A woman whispered, "This is heartbreaking." George hated that word. He didn't want pity. He wanted dignity. Raymond's voice rose again. You're all acting like I committed a crime. He was being difficult. George shook his head. I was sitting. A server came back with a napkin and held it out to George. For your face, she said softly. He took it and pressed it to his cheek. His hand trembled so much that the napkin shook. Raymond looked around the room and saw that no one was on his side. The phones, the whispers, the looks. He felt the control slipping away. That made him louder. I run this place, he said, and I decide who stays. George looked at the table in front of him. His food had gone cold. He no longer cared. He stood up slowly, using the edge of the table for support. The room seemed to spin for a moment. He took a breath and steadied himself. I don't want to fight you, George said. I just want to leave. Then leave, Raymond snapped. George picked up his wallet and the napkin. As he turned to walk away, his knee buckled slightly. The man in the blue shirt reached out and steadied him. I've got you, the man said. George nodded. Thank you. As he took a step forward, Raymond muttered under his breath, people like you are always causing scenes. George stopped walking. The words landed harder than the slap. He turned back slowly. I didn't cause this, he said. You did. Raymond laughed again. You don't belong here. The room erupted. That's enough, someone shouted. A woman yelled, you should be ashamed of yourself. Another voice said, this is going online. George stood in the middle of it all, feeling like the ground had opened beneath him. His heart pounded. His breathing was shallow. He thought about his son again, about how Elijah always told him, Dad, you don't have to accept disrespect. George had tried not to accept it, but he hadn't known what else to do. A man dialed his phone and spoke into it. Yes, I need police. A manager just assaulted an elderly customer. Raymond's face changed. You don't need to do that, he said quickly. We can handle this. No, the man said. You already handled it. George sat back down in the nearest seat because his legs could no longer hold him. His hands rested in his lap, still shaking. He stared at the floor. The room buzzed with voices. Some people comforted him. Others argued with Raymond. The servers stood frozen, unsure who to listen to. George felt like time had slowed. Every sound seemed too loud. Every face seemed too close. He thought about how simple his day had been supposed to be. A walk, a meal, a quiet hour before going home. Now he felt exposed, like his private life had been dragged into public view. A woman handed him a cup of water. Drink this, she said. He took a sip and nearly choked. His throat was tight with emotion. I didn't mean for this to happen, George whispered. The woman shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. Raymond stood near the counter pacing. He kept glancing at the door. The confidence he had shown moments earlier was cracking. George pressed the napkin to his cheek again. It no longer hurt as much physically, but something deeper ached inside him. He felt embarrassed for trusting this place, for believing it was safe. When the sound of sirens grew faintly in the distance, the room fell quiet again. Raymond muttered, This is ridiculous. George closed his eyes. He had come for lunch. Instead, he had been turned into a lesson in front of strangers. And he didn't yet know that the person who would change everything was already on his way. Elijah Thompson walked through the front door just as a man was shouting. He saw his father first. George sat near the center of the room with a napkin pressed to his cheek. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were shaking. People stood around him, some holding phones, others arguing with a man in a manager's jacket near the counter. Elijah stopped in his tracks. He crossed the room quickly. "Dad?" he said, kneeling beside him. "What happened to your face?" George looked up, surprised. "Elijah? I didn't know you were coming today." Elijah ignored that. "Who did this to you?" George hesitated. He didn't want to point. He didn't want to make it worse. "It's nothing. I just want to go home." Elijah looked around and saw the red mark on his father's cheek more clearly. His jaw tightened. "This is not nothing." A woman nearby spoke up. "The manager slapped him." Elijah stood and turned toward Raymond Carl. "You hit my father?" Raymond crossed his arms. "Your father was causing a disturbance. I told him to leave. He refused." George shook his head. "I was trying to finish my food." Elijah looked back at him. "Did you raise your voice?" "No," George said. "I didn't even stand up." Elijah faced Raymond again. "So you solved it by hitting an old man?" Raymond lifted his chin. "I'm in charge here." He wouldn't listen. Elijah's voice stayed calm, but it carried through the room. Listening does not mean putting your hands on someone. Phones were still recording. The room was quiet, except for Raymond's breathing. A man in a blue shirt said, "We all saw it. He slapped him for no reason." Raymond snapped, "Mind your business." "It is my business," Elijah said. "That's my father." Raymond looked at him more closely now. "And who are you supposed to be?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He helped George stand first, steadying him by the arm. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "My knees feel weak," George said. "I just want to sit." Elijah guided him back down. Then he turned to Raymond again. "You accused him of not belonging here." Raymond shrugged. "I decide who stays." Elijah took a breath. "Then you made a serious mistake today." The sound of sirens could be heard outside. Raymond's confidence flickered. "I was just doing my job." Elijah shook his head. "Your job is not to humiliate people." A server stepped forward. "Sir, he's been coming here every Friday for years." Raymond said nothing. Elijah looked around the room. Did anyone hear what he said before he hit him? Several voices answered at once. He told him to get out. He said he didn't belong. He raised his hand and slapped him. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He looked back at his father, who kept his eyes down. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Elijah said softly. George nodded. "I didn't want trouble." "I know," Elijah replied. "But you're not alone now." When the police entered the doorway, Elijah stepped forward. "I need to report an assault," he said. "That man hit my father." Raymond tried to speak before the officers reached him. "I was just enforcing the rules," he said, pointing at George. He refused to leave. One of the officers looked at George's face. "Sir, did he strike you?" George nodded slowly. "Yes, he slapped me." The room filled with quiet agreement. Several people raised their phones higher. A woman said, "We recorded everything." A man added, "He did it for no reason." Raymond's voice cracked. "I didn't mean it like that. He was being difficult." The officer turned to Elijah. "Is that your father?" "Yes," Elijah said, "and I watched him get blamed for sitting and eating." Raymond tried again. "I'm the manager here. I had to keep order." Elijah took a step forward. "Order doesn't mean assault." The officer asked Raymond, "Did you strike him?" Raymond hesitated. The room waited. "Yes," he said finally. "I hit him." That single word, changed everything. The officer nodded to his partner. We have witnesses and a confession. Raymond's face drained of color. You don't need to arrest me. We can talk this out. Elijah's voice stayed steady. You already talked with your hand. The officer turned back to Elijah. Are you pressing charges? Elijah looked at his father. George's eyes were tired, but clear. I don't want anyone else treated like this, George said quietly. Elijah nodded. Yes, I am. Raymond shook his head. You don't understand. I run this place. Elijah met his eyes. No, you don't. Raymond laughed once, nervous. What does that mean? Elijah reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. My name is Elijah Thompson. I own this restaurant. The room fell into a different kind of silence. Raymond stared at him. That's not true. Elijah handed the paper to the officer. Here's proof. I've stayed out of daily operations on purpose. I wanted to see how people were treated. The officer glanced at the document and handed it back. All right. Raymond's shoulders dropped. You're lying. Elijah shook his head. You assaulted my father. You embarrassed a customer. And you abused your position. Raymond tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. Elijah turned to the staff. This man no longer works here. The officer stepped closer to Raymond. Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back. Raymond's voice rose. This is a misunderstanding. It's not, the officer said. You admitted it. The cuffs clicked into place. George watched in silence as Raymond was led toward the door. His cheeks still burned, but something inside him felt lighter. As Raymond passed him, George spoke for the first time since the arrest began. I only wanted to eat my lunch. Raymond said nothing. When the door closed behind the officers, Elijah knelt beside his father again. I'm here now, he said, and this will never happen to you here again. George nodded slowly. I believe you. George sat quietly while the staff gathered near him. One by one, they spoke. I'm sorry you were treated that way, the young server said, her voice shaking. You didn't deserve that. Another worker nodded. We should have stopped it sooner. George looked at their faces and saw fear mixed with regret. You don't have to apologize for him, he said. But thank you for standing up when it mattered. Elijah stood beside his father. From today on, things change, he said to the room. No one will be judged here by how they look or how much they spend. This place will treat people with respect, or it won't operate at all. A man who had recorded the incident lowered his phone. That's what should have happened from the start. Elijah asked the staff to take a break while he spoke with them privately. When they returned, there was no shouting, no threats, only clear words. There will be training, Elijah said, and new leadership. Anyone who cannot treat customers with dignity will not work here. The workers nodded. Some looked relieved. George stood slowly, supported by Elijah. I don't want anyone fired because of me, he said. I just don't want this to happen to someone else. Elijah looked at him. That's exactly why we're doing this. Before leaving, the head server brought George a fresh meal in a takeaway box. On the house, she said. Whenever you come back, your table will be waiting. George held the bag in his hands and felt something he hadn't felt since the slap. Peace. Outside, the air felt lighter. As they walked to the car, George spoke. I didn't know you owned the place. Elijah smiled slightly. I wanted to see the truth. I didn't expect to see it this way. George nodded. People think old men don't matter. Today, they found out that's not true. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant changed. New signs went up with clear rules about behavior and respect. Complaints were taken seriously. Staff spoke up without fear. Customers noticed the difference. George returned the following Friday. The same server greeted him by name. Welcome back, Mr. Thompson. He sat down and ate in silence, just like before. But the silence felt different now. it felt safe again. What happened to George spread through the community, not as a story of shame, but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity does not come from power. It comes from how people treat one another when no one thinks they're watching. George had only wanted lunch. What he received instead was proof that respect can be restored, that wrong can be corrected, and that no one is too old, too quiet, or too ordinary to deserve justice. George's story reminds us that dignity has no age, no color, and no condition. What began as a simple meal became a moment that exposed cruelty and replaced it with accountability. Justice didn't come from anger. It came from truth, from witnesses, and from the courage to speak up. This is how change starts, when one wrong is no longer ignored. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in stories that shine light on respect, courage, and real-life lessons, subscribe to this channel now. We tell stories that matter, stories about people, justice, and the power of doing what's right.